people hear me okay?
Oh, yeah, that's really good sound there.
I just,
It's really
last time it was cutting in and out, so
perfect now.
we're going to hope it doesn't do that again. All right, well, let's start with the word of prayer and we'll get into our class. Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we have to come together today to study your word, just be with those that are not here for whatever reason, be it sickness or traveling. Just pray that they might be able to be with us at the next point in time. Father, we thank you for your word and the guidance it provides us in our lives and the insight into your will. Just help us always to be doers of your word. Be with us now as we enter into this time of study. In your son's name we pray. Amen. All right. We're kind of taking a tour through Esther, um, looking at this concept of God's providence. So we're going to be looking into Esther chapter 3 today. Again, we're not studying this book in typical fashion. We're just kind of surveying it from the standpoint of God's providence. Now, here in chapter 3, what we begin to read is what I'm calling one of the turning points in this book. Now, one reason chapter 3 is a turning point in the book of Esther is because this chapter records for us the beginning of the adversity that God's people would face as a result of the actions taken by Haman, that verse 1 of this chapter tells us was promoted following the events of chapter 2. Now, what we also read about Haman here in verse 1, we're told that he was the son of an individual named Hammedatha the Agagite, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Now, we have to ask why he's described in this way. Now, from the context of the chapter, as well as from the greater context of the Old Testament, one reason Haman is presented in this way is because the author wants his readers to know that Haman was descended from a line of people who were always at war with the Jews. Now, one reason we know this is because the word Agagite, it's a word that actually refers to the people known as the Amalekites that were descended from Amalek that were defeated by God's people in Exodus chapter 17. Now, in verse 16 of Exodus 17, Moses said that the Lord swore that his people would always be at war against Amalek from generation to generation. And so for Haman to be identified in this way as the son of someone who was an Agagite would indicate to the Jewish audience of this book that Haman was descended from a people who had an intense hatred toward the Jews. And we're going to see this more as we get into the book, Haman's hatred of Mordecai, but also of the Jews as a whole. So going on with verse 1, the verse concludes by telling us that King King Xerxes, in other words, advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. So just from the information in verse 1, what position did Haman occupy?
Vice President.
Vice president, we might say.
Not really, but second in command of him sounds like.
Yeah.
Spot, whatever it
Yeah, absolutely. Dad said prime minister over here. Yeah, it's, from all appearances, it seems he's second in command. He had this authority. Everybody was expected to respect him. And so the picture being painted here is that Haman was just under the Persian king himself. Anything else on verse 1? Absolutely. He would reflect the views of King Xerxes if he's elevated to this position.
Or at least most of them anyway. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
mostly that in that comment. But mostly it sounds like he had to, or he wouldn't have done that.
In a biblical comparison,
Yeah, that's a good illustration of this, Joseph to Pharaoh. So, um, anything else on verse 1? Okay. So, verse 1 sets the stage for the things that are recorded in the remainder of the 15 verses that make up chapter 3, where we learn about the beginning of the adversity that would come on God's people as a result of the actions taken by Haman. Now, with this being the case, what we're going to do today is just briefly examine verses 2 through 15. It's a big chunk that we're going to be covering, but again, we're just going to kind of survey it and consider for ourselves 3 reasons as to why adversity can come into the lives of God's people. The first reason we'll consider, based on verses 2 through 6, is that adversity can come because of our refusal to follow the crowd. The second reason we'll consider, based on verses 7 through 11, is that adversity can come because of the deception of others. And finally, the third reason we'll consider, based on verses 12 through 15, is that adversity can come simply because of who we are. So we'll take this, again, just a chunk at a time. So if somebody wouldn't mind reading verses 2 through 6.
All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him, but Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes.
Well, yours reads a lot differently than mine did, but that's okay. So again, the first reason we're going to look at as to why adversity can come, and that's because of our refusal to follow the crowd. Now, what were people doing to Haman from these verses we just read? Absolutely, yeah. They were giving him honor. So, and why were they doing that, according to these verses? What does the text say? The king commanded it. So, this is the scenario. People are bowing down to Haman because of the king's command. But what was Mordecai doing? He was refusing to comply. Now, something we should keep in mind here, what is said here is similar to the stories we read about in Daniel chapters 3 and 6, where we find that Daniel and his friends refused to worship the golden image built by Nebuchadnezzar, and when Daniel refused to pray to Darius. Now, if this is a similar situation, why would Mordecai refuse to comply? That's it. That's probably the most likely reason. Because of his responsibility to God, he would see this as worshiping Haman, which, yeah, they have no other gods before me. Questions or comments on verse 2? Okay. So going on into verse 3, how are the other people responding to this?
They noticed
They noticed it?
that he didn't bow down before him.
Absolutely. So what did they ask?
Why aren't you?
exactly. So yeah, they're asking, why are you not doing what you're commanded to do? Now, what is not recorded for us here, however, is how Mordecai answered this question. His answer is not recorded for us in the text. Now, since that's true, all we can suggest here is that Mordecai's refusal to obey the king's command is because of his recognition that only God is to be worshipped in the way that the king had commanded Haman to be worshipped. Questions or comments on any of that? Okay. I know we're moving through this pretty quickly, but so building on what was said in verse 3, in verse 4, the author of Esther records for us that after a period of time in which the rest of the king's servants had spoken daily to Mordecai, and when Mordecai would not listen to them, the king's servants proceeded to inform Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand as a result of the fact that he had told them he was a Jew. So here in verse 4, what's going on? Okay.
Very reasonable. They didn't, as soon as they saw that, they didn't initially go to Haman and say, "Oh, this guy's not worshiping you or whatever." It said that for some period of time, we don't know how long, they discussed it with him, and eventually did, and he was breaking the law of the land too.
Absolutely.
So that spoke fairly highly of their
Character?
character, I think. That's what I got out of that. That's one thing.
Right. Absolutely.
Their character was acted pretty good.
Yeah. So they were being, yeah, as Don put it, reasonable about this. So yeah, they're having a discussion. They questioned Mordecai, and the text says on a daily basis. And after Mordecai continued to ignore them, these servants told Haman, because Mordecai had said he was a Jew. So he's revealing his identity as a Jew. Now, Esther, up to this point, has not done that, but that's another point. So this tells us that one reason Mordecai refused to worship Haman is because of his Jewish ancestry. And since that's the case, this is why we can suggest that Mordecai's refusal to bow down to Haman had something to do with his devotion to God as one of his chosen people. As a result of this, the king's servants would inform Haman of these things in order to see if this is something Haman would approve of. Anything else on verse 4? Okay. So, recording for us the response of Haman to what was said in verses 3 and 4, what happens in verse 5? What is Haman's response, in other words? He's filled with wrath or enraged. New American Standard has filled with rage. So, this has the sense that after seeing that Mordecai refused to bow down in worship toward Haman, he had these feelings of intense anger. Now, you can be angry, but wrath or rage is another level of anger. What's the difference between anger and wrath? Uncontrollable. It's that, I heard it put once, it's that white hot kind of anger. Yeah, we.
I think that's exactly what this shows, by the way. Obviously, the king had made a mistake. That he didn't have the character and other qualities needed for that responsibility.
Absolutely. And we're going to see this as we get further into the book. Haman is kind of two-faced, is the way we can describe it. He's very manipulative, even of the king himself. And this is all coming from a place of his hatred of Mordecai. So, anything else on verse 5? Yeah.
But out of 1,000 people,
That's true.
And,
Well, that comes out in the text.
I think so
So
too, but he doesn't even know about this one that's not doing it until he's told about it.
that's true.
It's not like Mordecai is standing in front of him and not bowing down. He has to be told about this.
Yeah, in the text, Mordecai is the only one that comes out because Mordecai is the one of part of the story. Um, but this could extend to other Jews as well. But something else to consider is, as far as we know, Mordecai is the only Jew in this citadel of Susa that we've looked at where the king had his center of power. That's a good question to ask. I mean, because the other Jews might not have wanted to do this either, but that doesn't come out in the text because, yes, in verse 6, we learn that Haman not only becomes angry with Mordecai, but his anger extends to all the Jews. And that'll bring us into verse 6. But anything else on verse? Go ahead, Elaine. Absolutely. Because they come from that line of people who were always at war with the Jews.
It doesn't tell us that they were speculating wildly on if the others wouldn't bow down. But what it does tell us is that he was told who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews. I think it's pointing clearly towards that age-old that sort of relationship is just showing forth with that. The
Absolutely.
way that's put in there, I don't think it was. They're all failing to bow down. No, I don't think that's what it's about.
Yeah, I mean that, and that's exactly what verse 6 gets at is the anger extends to all the Jews. So if you were to put verse 6 in your own words, what's Haman setting out to do? Find some way of punishing them. So Haman would not only punish Mordecai, but all people who shared in Mordecai's Jewish ancestry. Now, also, what we should also know here is that what is said here in verse 6 is what sets the stage for the rest of the events that we read about in the book of Esther, which is Haman's plot to destroy the Jews and how through Esther, God would intervene on behalf of his people. Now, we have to remember God's name is not mentioned once in the book of Esther, but when you get into the book and see the things that happen, you can see God's hand working behind the scenes through this woman Esther, and not to mention through Mordecai. So, putting verses 1 through 6 together, the principle we should see here about adversity is that adversity in the lives of God's people can come because of our refusal to follow the crowd. Now, what we see in these verses is that adverse circumstances came as a result of Mordecai refusing to do what others were doing. Now, many times, a refusal to follow the crowd comes from a place of what we feel is our responsibility to God. It's the obey God over man principle. So sometimes it's our faithfulness to God that can bring about adverse circumstances because we are choosing to be faithful to God rather than follow in the ways of the world. Anything else on verses 1 through 6? Yeah, that's true. That goes back to chapter 1. Anything else on verses 1 through 6? All right. Let's go to the second point we're going to look at, verses 7 through 11. Adversity can come because of the deception of others. If somebody wouldn't mind reading verses 7 through 11. Okay. Just quick question, Elaine. Did you say the 25th year there in verse 7? Because I have the 12th year. Okay, just checking. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Um, anyway, just wanted to make sure. Uh, so again, we're looking at the point that adversity can come because of the deception of others. Now, verse 7 is just a timeline. Yeah, I'm. Oh my. All right. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Sorry about that. I started to hear the static, and then my wife's look on her face indicate to me something was wrong. So, um, so again, verse 7 is just a timeline, and it tells us that the pur, that is the lot, was cast before Haman day to day and from month to month until the 12th month, which is the month Adar. Now, the first thing I think we should understand here is that the timeline that is given here is described according to the Jewish calendar in conjunction with how long King Ahasuerus Xerxes had been in power when the things described in this verse were taking place. Now, with this in mind, the month Nisan falls somewhere in March or April, whereas the month Adar is somewhere in February or March, since it is the end of the Jewish calendar. But the point being made here is that it was during this time frame that this pur, that is the lot, was cast before Haman. So we're looking at the concept of the casting of lots is what's coming out here. Now, what was the purpose of the casting of lots? Can anyone tell me? It helped them to make decisions, is what this was about. Now, these lots were something like pebbles or something of that nature. We can compare it to throwing dice, but these weren't actual dice. But what was the purpose of this casting of lots in this particular context? To select a day and month as to when this plot to destroy the Jews would be carried out. Anything else on verse 7? All right. Verse 8. Now, going on into verse 8, the writer of Esther records for us the first part of a request that Haman would make of the king to authorize the extermination of the Jews. Now, what's Haman doing here in verse 8? Absolutely. That's exactly what he's doing. This is why we can say Haman is a manipulative person. He's accusing the Jews, since their customs, which I think your translation read, Elaine, were different. And so he's telling the king, they're not following your laws. And so that's what he says about them. So what else does he say there in verse 8?
And that's not in the king's best interest.
It's not in,
Around.
yeah, that's what he's saying there. You shouldn't keep them around, king, because they're not following your laws.
Is he telling you a complete lie?
He is telling a complete
No,
lie.
no, he's not.
Oh,
Mordecai is not obeying the king's command. So he's not telling a complete lie, but he's not telling the whole truth.
he's not telling the whole truth. Yeah,
So he's not completely lying, but he's not being honest.
right. Yeah, he's not being completely honest. He's twisting the situation because of what he's setting out to do. This is Haman's intention to destroy the Jews.
I was going to say that mine reads at the end of it, therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain.
Right.
And that's pretty blunt. I mean, he's not going to put him in jail. He's not going to give him anything. He's not going to give him a trial. He's not going to do anything. They just get to be destroyed, period.
But I think
Yeah.
also back to when the Jews began to inhabit the promised land, they were told to destroy the people so that they couldn't influence them.
That's true.
And so he has a point.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of the reverse is happening now to the Jews. They're being pointed out for their influences that aren't welcome.
That's true. Anything else on verse 8?
We have to remember this is the Old Testament.
Yeah,
I mean, and I mean that's the bottom line because it is not the gospel of love.
that's right. There's under the old covenant here. Anything else on verse 8? Okay. So, verse 8 has been said. He makes his statement there. Now, what does he request of the king in verse 9? Genocide.
Honestly, I mean, we're talking about, I think Esther's about 5th century BC, but we're talking about 20th century Germany here too.
That's true. That's a good
We're
comparison.
talking about what Haman is talking about here. That's what the Nazis were talking about in
Yeah.
20th century Germany.
Yeah, that's a good illustration of it.
We're not that far removed from this sort of thing.
That's true. So, what does he ask the king to do? I mean, genocide, yeah, that's in there, but to make it, yeah, a decree, a law. It's an order. So, in his request to the king, Haman is asking here that the king give this order for all the Jews to be destroyed. Now, what does Haman say he'll do in return?
Pay 10,000 talents of silver.
Pay 10,000 talents of silver. So, what's Haman doing? Bribery. Yeah, that's it. He's bribing the king. Now, also, if you're curious, the amount of 10,000 talents of silver is the equivalent of 375 tons of silver. And according to the research I came about, this would be worth about $96 million in today's money. And so this is a lot of money that he's offering, and this would all go back into the king's treasuries, the text says. Any other questions or comments on verse 9?
Where did Haman get all that money?
That is the question. He was probably a wealthy individual, especially being in the position that he was in. The text does not record that for us.
Doesn't say, but I think this kind of makes sense. My footnote suggests that possibly he was going to get that plunder from the Jews.
Possibly,
And which means they were doing well.
yeah. So that's possibly that this would come from.
It doesn't say that.
No, and right. Yeah, the text does not record for us where that money would come from. Anything else on verse 9? Okay. So what does the king do in verse 10?
Approves it, basically.
And what does he give to Haman?
His signet.
His signet ring. Can anyone tell me what this signet ring is about? It sealed something into law, and we know that because this was sometimes stamped, used as a stamp to seal something into law. So the author of Esther is recording for us that the king authorized Haman's request. But again, he repeats who Haman is, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. So this was something that was already recorded for us in verse 1, but it's added, the enemy of the Jews. That's the point of emphasis in this verse. Questions or comments on verse 10? Okay. So going on to verse 11, what does the king say? Exactly. Do with the people what you want. So he's granting the permission. Now, since that's true, this should help us to understand that the phrase, the silver is yours, is a phrase that indicates that Haman was free to do what he wished with the silver that he offered to the king. Again, we don't know how he came about all that money, but the king says, do what you want. That silver is yours. Do what you wish. So putting verses 7 through 11 together, the point we should see from these verses about adversity is that adversity can come because of the deception of others. Now again, what Haman said to the king was not the whole truth. So Haman led the king to believe that the Jews in the Persian Empire were living in complete disobedience to the king. Now, as a result of these things, the king would authorize Haman to destroy the Jews as he saw fit. So this brings us into verses 12 through 15. Adversity can come because of who we are. Now, if somebody wouldn't mind reading those verses for us. Not everyone at once.
I can do that if you want me to.
Thank you, Don.
Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and it was written just as Haman commanded to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, and to the princes of each people, each province according to the script, each people according to its language, being written in the name of the king Ahasuerus, and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by carrier to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. A copy of the edict to be issued as law in every province was published to all the peoples, so they should be ready for this day. The carriers went out impelled by the king's command, while the decree was issued at the citadel in Susa, and while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was in confusion.
All right. A lot of information here. So this point is introduced with the author of Esther telling us in verse 12 that the king's scribes were summoned in order to write what was commanded to the king's satraps and other people who were in positions of authority in the Persian Empire. Now the picture being painted here is that the law was being given and was sent out to people of all nationalities and languages. So the order's going out to the whole Persian Empire to give people the knowledge the Jews are going to be destroyed. So since that's true, as was pointed out earlier, we could compare this to what Hitler commanded to be done in Germany during the time leading up to World War II. The order goes out, annihilate the Jews. Anything else on verse 12?
It's even worse. I mean, I don't know if it's worse, but like Herod to round them up and do it all in one day.
Yeah,
Wow.
That's exactly the picture being painted. It round them up, and as Andrew said, do it all in one day. So according to verse 13, who's delivering these letters?
Couriers.
And what do couriers do? Yeah, they take messages from one person. They deliver the mail. They're postal workers. Yeah. So this carries with it the idea that messengers of some sort were sent out to deliver letters concerning the fact that in one day all the Jews in the Persian Empire would be destroyed and have their possessions taken from them. Now, again, the time frame mentioned here would be roughly sometime in February or March. But also what is said here suggests that these letters were sent out sometime in advance of the annihilation. It's giving them time to be ready, the Jews to be ready for what's about to happen to them. But what we should also understand from this, that since this annihilation would occur sometime in the future, this would create time for people like Esther to have this law reversed, and that's going to be much at the risk of her own life. And that's something we're going to see as we get further into the book. Anything else on verse 13? Okay. So, building upon that, in verse 14, the writer of Esther goes on to tell us that a copy of the edict to be issued as law in every province was published to all the people so that they should be ready for this day. Now, what's happening there in verse 14?
They posted
Posted
it on Facebook.
it on Facebook.
They made a public proclamation so everybody, not just the governors,
Right. Everybody's becoming aware of what's about to happen to the Jews. And this would give the Jews time to prepare for what's about to happen to them.
And going back to chapter 1 and verse 18, and some of the silliness that they have is when they establish a law, it can't be changed.
Right. And that's something that's going to become important in the story.
Yeah.
So,
They're by it being established as a law and being posted, then it can't be changed.
right.
So,
And that's what's going to create some of the challenges for Esther, and not to mention Mordecai.
boy, that's a dumb law.
It is a dumb law.
Established that something can't be changed.
Yeah, that's true. That is a dumb law. Anything else on verse 14? Okay. Verse 15, it tells us the couriers were impelled by the king's command while a decree was issued at the citadel in Susa. And while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was in confusion. Now, what's verse 15 telling us? What's the situation here?
Haman got what he wanted, so he was happy and sat down to drink and wasn't worried about anything, and everybody else was in chaos.
That's right. So Haman and the king are just shooting the breeze, so to speak. So those carrying the letters were rushed through the king's command, while the document concerning the destruction of the Jews was being given in Susa. Susa itself was thrown into a state of confusion. Now, from the context, the reason Susa would have been thrown into confusion is because of a failure to understand why a law was being issued that would result in the annihilation of the Jews. So yes, this is chaos, as Pam put it. Now, one reason we might be able to assume this is because the word confusion here comes from a word that carries with it the idea of being lost. Now, applying that here, this refers to the fact that the city was at a loss because of this document that's being issued. They wouldn't understand why this was going on. So putting verses 12 through 15 together, the point we should see from these verses about adversity is that adversity can come because of who we are. Now, in these verses, the author of Esther is showing that the adversity that was coming to the Jews was simply because of their identity as Jews. No other reason. So this is another reason we can compare what is written here to Nazi Germany. Because under the Nazi regime, what was carried out against the Jews was carried out because of who they were. So, any other questions or comments on verses 12 through 15 before we wrap things up? Okay. So, having looked at chapter 3, the question we have to ask is, what in the world does this have to do with God's providence? Now, in answering what adversity has to do with God's providence, we need to understand that it's sometimes times of adversity that allow us opportunities to prove our faithfulness to God. Another way that adversity and God's providence are related is in the fact that God uses these times to train us to trust in Him. And so since these things are true, this should help us to consider those times of adversity as a time of joy, as described in James 1, 2 through 4. Anything else? All right. Matt, will you close us in prayer?